So today we're going to talk about sex more than dreams. I think I did a video a while ago called Sex in Dreams. It should have been Sex in Dreams because that was a video about when you dream about sex. This video is a little different. There are two categories of experience that coaches, by and large, do not deal with. One is the dream world, despite my efforts of teaching an ICF certified course for 3.5 years. The idea of working with dreams is not something that is sort of comes naturally to the coaching community. And I think there are reasons for that. But the other area that coaches don't deal with is sex. And there's some very good reasons. There's absolutely nothing that I've ever seen in the coaching curriculum that deals with sex. But more importantly, like in any of these healing modalities, you really have no business trying to help somebody in an area where you haven't done your own work. And I can think back to my coaching cohort some years back. There were 35 people in that class, and this is just off the top of my head. I think there was maybe one woman who I had a sense had an understanding of her own sexuality and could probably help somebody in this area. There are two things that if you want to, get some help in this kind of area that you want to look for. One is education, but education is not always the best consideration. You also want to get a sense from the person as if whether they've dealt with their own sexuality. And that's virtually impossible in the therapeutic arena, where you're not entitled to ask any personal questions about a therapist. Very different from the coaching world. I have been asked about my sexuality. I have had clients who are gay men and have asked me, have I ever had a homosexual experience? And that's fine. That's part of the relationship, because not a hierarchical relationship. Okay, enough of that stuff. What I do want to talk to you about today are things that come up in terms of people who are in relationships that have to do with sex. And most of it has to do with what is not said. Okay. So, and a lot of that revolves around fantasy. Now, sexuality in the United States is a very complex issue. Culturally, we've got a lot of fixations and phobias and, frankly, really screwed up ideas about sexuality. So when you as an individual want to begin to deal with this, it's kind of fraught. The first thing that's necessary, and this is if you're in a relationship, is that there's got to be enough trust in the relationship. There's got to be enough communication in the relationship to even begin to explore sexuality as it relates to these fantasies you carry in your head. And what I want to talk about today is a very specific fantasy. And I want to talk about it a number of different ways. So one of the things, if you watch these videos, is that I'm not a big fan of diagnosis. Unfortunately, in the world that I work in now, I don't need to be. I don't need to deal with that. But the other thing that I'm very concerned about is the way we use language. So, for example, we have something called healthcare, which is not about health. It's about sickness, okay? It's about what do you do when you get sick and who pays for it? And then we have this thing within this thing we call healthcare, which is not healthcare, called preventative healthcare. It's not preventative healthcare. You get a colonoscopy to discover if you are sick, not to prevent being sick, okay? So we use language in a way that really clouds the issue and screws things all up and gets people talking about things that are upside down across the board. Here's a big one. The literature will tell you that one of the most predominant, if I don't think it's the most predominant, but a predominant fantasy of women is what they call a rape fantasy. Okay, that's nuts, calling something a rape fantasy. It's not nobody wants to be raped. No man wants to be raped either. And no man certainly wants to be a rapist, except for the pathological folks out there who we need to lock up. Okay. Well, we've named it this. Why? Because the fantasy is in a woman of being taken, and being taken in a sense against her will, desiring that. All right. So let me sort of back this up a little bit and talk about consent. I have a friend in New York who is a very highly educated and a very good practitioner in working with other women. At some point early in her life, she earned what sounds like a pretty good living as a stripper. And what she said to me was, it's consensual objectification. I, as the stripper, am giving consent to be objectified. As a matter of fact, I'm inviting being objectified, and I'm being compensated for that. The club that I work in is paying me, and the men who are watching me are paying me. And that is an agreement. I am giving consent for this to happen. So that got me thinking. And there's a term out there now. We have labels for everything. Some of them are useful. I think this one probably is. It's called CNC, consensual non-consensual sex, or consensual non-consensual fantasies. Okay. It's desiring something that in the broader culture would be looked at as, oh my God, this is an assault, this is a sexual assault, and this is terrible. But it's a desire. What is that desire? Is it a desire to be assaulted? No, it's not. It is the idea in a woman, and obviously this has been told to me, I'll tell you about what it is in a man, but it's a desire in a woman to be so overwhelmingly desirable that her partner cannot resist. Okay, that's what it's based on. And as you know, most of my work is based on desire. What do you want? All right. And what you want is not something you have rationally thought through and figured out, this is a good thing, I will do this. Okay. 9 times out of 10, that stuff doesn't work. Desire comes from a place that is not cognitive. It's just what you want. Now, so in a man, there is the desire to possess in that fantasy. There is the desire to dominate. There is certainly not the desire to do any physical harm or psychological trauma. So here we are with a male and a female fantasy that's both wrapped around a similar experience, but nobody can talk about it. And particularly it's difficult for a woman in the Me Too era, where there are a lot of women who are coming forward and saying, I've been assaulted, and this is the guy who did it. And guess what? In this industry, there are a lot of men who are doing this. So that's going on, and yet this woman is having this fantasy. Well, that brings up a lot of shame. Like, what is wrong with you? Or what is wrong with me if you're the woman? It doesn't compute. Well, it begins to compute if you think about it from the standpoint of desire, from the standpoint of wanting to be desired, to the point where your partner loses control. There are also healthy relationships where a woman has said to a man, yeah, this is what I want. Now, that becomes sometimes a bigger problem, because the man, and I can speak with some authority about this, isn't sure when, right? When is this okay? And the problem is that the communication of the fantasy is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. There's a lot of exploration that needs to happen, not over the breakfast table, but in an intimate setting in which you can really begin to explore and understand and give each other signals and that kind of thing. So why am I talking about this today? Well, as I said, there are 2 reasons. One is that this has come up a number of times recently. And whenever that happens, I feel like, okay, it's time for me to talk about this. The other thing I want to say 2 other things about this. It may be that you have this fantasy, but you have no desire to act it out. It's your own private fantasy. Maybe it's something that you use to get aroused. But it is not something that you want to get into with your partner. And that could be because any number of reasons. A little bit of a lack of trust, like they're going to think I'm weird, or they're going to think I'm a crazy person, and they're going to be frightened, or whatever it is. And it does take a lot of trust in a relationship to get past that kind of stuff and to begin to talk about it. And the other thing could be, you just, it's a fantasy. You don't want to do it. There are a lot of things in life like that, like going and telling somebody what you think of them, that is not going to be any good for you or them or anything. So I'm not suggesting to you that every sexual fantasy that you have needs to be acted out. What I am suggesting to you is that it is useful if you feel like you are in a safe relationship, and that goes for men as well as women. I mean, men have a concern about being, number one, rejected, and number two, thought of as some lunatic. It works both ways. It's a fear that lives in a relationship, and if it's unspoken, it can lead to some problems if there is a desire to act on the fantasy. So it's important, I think, to understand that lots of times we label things in a way that make them worse than they already seem. Rape fantasy is a terrible, horrendous label. It's in the literature. It's nuts. It doesn't make any sense. It's like telling a seven-year-old kid who's hungry that they're food insecure. Who the hell figured that out or thought that up? Okay. So that's the point of this, is that the labels are the problem. Lastly, what I would say to you is this, I have a particular approach. I have a particular approach to working with dreams, and I have a particular approach in terms of helping people with their relationships, whether they be, in the executive coaching realm, in corporations, or with their significant others. And my approach is to try and ground it as much as possible. I mean, parenthetically, there are a number of people who are, experimenting with open marriages and polyamory. Okay, I have some experience with that well before we even knew what the word polyamory was about. It's not a walk in the park. You've taken some other people on, that's a big deal. So you need to understand what you're getting into, and you need to talk about this a lot and decide whether or not that's what you want. So that's my approach. I'm one guy, okay? If what I say in these videos resonates with you and is useful to you, great. If some of it is, great. If other part of it is not, then don't. Because the thing we are faced with very much, and it would seem, it's always difficult for me to sort of gauge whether it's worse now than it ever was, but there are so many people who want to give up their sovereignty to somebody else, right? Tell me what's right, tell me what's wrong. So then I got the rules and I don't have to think about it, and I'm aligned and I have a membership button and whatever the hell it is, right? That is not a useful thing for a human being to do, okay? You need to maintain and live in your sovereignty. You need to own your own emotional experience and not be ashamed of it and not feel as though it can't be communicated. As I said, you need to evaluate who you communicate it to, that's for sure. But there is no clear and final answer other than the sort of two basic rules: do unto others as you would have done unto you. And that covers a lot of ground. And the fact of the matter is, and this is the second one, is that the only thing that matters is who you love and who loves you. The rest of it is a bunch of details, right? So that's the message I wanted to give you today. When you look at labels and they don't seem to, or they cause you some problem, or they don't seem to reflect what the reality is, question them. Come up with a different label. Find out a way to talk about things where there isn't this burden that somebody else has put on your fantasies. None of their damn business. Okay, it's your business. So take care of yourselves. We're getting there. There's all kinds of stuff out there about whether this thing is coming back or not or whatever, but we're headed in the right direction. And I think we're going to come into the middle of this year and begin to emerge into something completely different than what we went in with. And I'm looking forward to that. And I hope you are too. So I'll talk to you soon.